Returning late from work, a millionaire spotted a small figure sneaking out of his mansion through the window. Enraged upon catching the intruder, a girl of only 7 years old carrying a black bag, he rushed after her, shouting, "Thief! You won't get away!" When the child stumbled and fell onto the lawn, crying desperately, he tore the bag from her hands, certain he would find precious jewels or stolen luxury watches. But when he opened it, his heart shattered. Arthur Sterling despised the night, not for the darkness, which he considered an ally of order and silence, but for what it represented, the end of a productive day and the beginning of empty hours inside a mansion that echoed his own solitude. The crunch of his German sedan's tires on the gravel driveway was the only sound to break the solemn peace of the estate. The house lights, triggered by a motion sensor, cascaded on, revealing the imposing stone and glass facade, a modern fortress against a world he saw as chaotic and unpredictable. For Arthur, control was everything. Every plant in the meticulously manicured garden, every piece of art arranged on the walls, every decision in his corporate empire was a testament to his philosophy. Success was born from iron discipline and the absence of sentimentality. Compassion, in his worldview, was a vulnerability, a door left open for manipulation. Tonight, however, something was out of place. As he stepped out of the car, the crisp autumn breeze carried an unsettling feeling, a dissonance in the controlled symphony of his life. That's when he saw it, a tiny shadow, a blur of rapid movement behind the library's ground floor picture window. It wasn't one of his staff. They had rigid schedules and would never dare remain after hours without his express permission. A wave of icy fury surged through his veins. An invasion, a violation. Someone had dared to cross his boundaries, to profane his sanctuary of order. His first instinct was to trigger the silent alarm, but something held him back. A visceral need to confront the intruder personally, to look disorder in the eye and reassert his dominance. Leaving his leather briefcase on the car seat, he circled the house with silent, determined strides, his expensive shoes barely making a sound on the damp grass. He knew every inch of this property, every blind spot. The back door, leading to the kitchen, would be locked, but the pantry window had an old latch that sometimes failed. It was a minor flaw, an imperfection he'd planned to fix, but which now became an advantage. As he'd imagined, the window gave way with a gentle push. He slipped into the dark pantry, the scent of spices and grains filling the air. His heart beat with a cold, calculated precision, the adrenaline sharpening his senses. He moved through the kitchen's gloom, past the cold marble countertops, toward the library, from where the muffled sound of a hurried movement confirmed his suspicions. When he reached the doorway, he saw the scene that ignited his rage. A small figure in worn-out clothes stood with their back to him, hastily stuffing items into a black sack. The moonlight filtering through the window revealed only a child's silhouette. But Arthur's mind registered not the age, only the act. A thief was a thief. He imagined the child was bait, a distraction for larger accomplices who might be elsewhere in the house. With 3 long, silent strides, he crossed the room. His hand, strong and unforgiving, landed on the intruder's small shoulder. The figure jumped. A sharp, frightened gasp stifled the instant they turned and saw him. They were the eyes of a little girl, no older than 7, wide with pure terror. In her arms, she clutched the black sack with the force of someone protecting their very life. Arthur's initial assumptions solidified. She was part of a crew, trained to look innocent and evoke pity. He wouldn't fall for that trap. His voice emerged like a shard of ice, cutting through the library's silence. "What do you think you're doing?" The girl just trembled, unable to form a word. Her eyes locked on his, reflecting an overwhelming panic. He yanked at the sack, but she held on with surprising strength, a low growl escaping her throat. His patience, already frayed, snapped like an overstretched cord. With a brusque movement, he lunged, determined to rip the bag from her hands and uncover the secret she guarded with such terror. Arthur's instinct was for pure domination. He was stronger, taller, a force of nature against which the small intruder stood no chance. Yet her resistance surprised him. It wasn't the struggle of a seasoned criminal, but the desperate defense of a cornered animal protecting its young. With a firm tug, he felt the cheap fabric of the sack begin to give. Seeing the battle was lost, the girl suddenly let go of the handle and, with an agility that caught him off guard, spun on her heels and bolted toward the dark hallway leading to the exit. Her run was clumsy, fueled by panic. Her bare feet made little noise on the polished marble, but her ragged breathing echoed through the silent house. Arthur followed, his anger giving way to a cold irritation. Her audacity was unbelievable. Reaching the main hall, the girl tried to open the heavy oak front door, but her small arms lacked the strength to turn the complex handle. In desperation, she turned and fled back toward the garden, slipping out through the same window she had entered. Arthur watched her from the kitchen doorway as she stumbled across the perfectly manicured lawn. Her escape ended abruptly and pathetically. The tip of her foot caught on the edge of a recessed sprinkler head, and she went down with a dull thud, her small body rolling once before stopping. A sharp, pained sob cut through the night air. It wasn't a cry of frustration, but of pure desperation and fear. The performance, if it was one, was horribly convincing. He approached slowly, the black sack still in his hand. He stopped a few feet from her, an imposing figure under the cold moonlight. The girl was curled on the ground, her face buried in her arms, her small shoulders shaking violently. He felt no pity. He felt contempt for such an obvious attempt at emotional manipulation. "The show is over," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. He knelt, not out of compassion, but to get a better look at the bag. With a quick, unceremonious motion, he opened it. His eyes scanned the contents, expecting to find his late mother's jewelry, watches from his collection, or perhaps some small, valuable electronics. He was prepared for the proof of the crime, for the confirmation of his worst expectations about human nature, but there was nothing of the sort. His fingers, which had expected to touch the cold metal of a watch or the faceted surface of a gemstone, instead found the cold plastic of a milk carton. Beside it were 2 cans of beans, a loaf of cheap white bread, and a slightly bruised apple. Arthur's world, built on certainties and immutable rules, seemed to stop for an instant. He stared at the items, then at the sobbing girl on the ground. It made no sense. The logic that governed his life dissolved in the face of this absurd, bewildering reality. This wasn't a thief's haul. It was the grocery run of a desperate homemaker. What was this? A new kind of con, a mockery. The girl raised her head, her face streaked with dirt and tears. Her eyes met his, and the fear in them was different now. It was no longer the fear of being caught, but the fear of having failed. Her lips trembled, and the words came out in a nearly inaudible whisper, carried on an urgency that pierced Arthur's armor of skepticism. "Please, Mister, don't take it. It's for my brother." He remained silent, confusion paralyzing his ability to react. She seemed to take his silence as a cue to continue, her voice gaining a thread of desperate strength. "He's real sick. His stomach hurts so bad, he won't stop crying, and he hasn't eaten in 2 days. The luxurious garden, the silent night, the imposing mansion, it all faded away. All that remained was the weight of those words and the image of a sick child, waiting somewhere in the dark for a little bread and milk that would never arrive. Her words hung in the cold air, small puffs of vapor dissipating into the darkness. A sick brother. Starvation. Arthur felt a pang of something he refused to name. It was irritation, he told himself, irritation at having his time wasted on such a cliched, sentimental story. A trick, it had to be. It was a well-rehearsed script, designed to tug at the heartstrings of sentimental fools and empty their wallets. He was no fool. He looked at the girl's face, now illuminated by the light spilling from the kitchen. There was a thin cut on her cheek, and the dirt seemed ingrained in the lines of her skin. Her eyes, however, were alarmingly clear. They didn't waver, didn't blink with falsehood. They stared at him with a mixture of terror and pleading that was unnervingly genuine. He stood up, the bag of food still in his hand. His brain, accustomed to analyzing balance sheets and predicting market shifts, tried to process the data. Fact: a child broke into his house. Fact: she took items of negligible value to him but essential for survival. Claim: a younger brother is seriously ill from lack of food. The equation didn't add up. If it was a scheme, why not steal something that could be sold? A small silver object, a tablet, why milk and bread? The inefficiency of the crime disturbed him almost as much as the intrusion itself. He needed more information to expose the farce. "Where are your parents?" he asked, his voice still hard, an instrument of interrogation. The girl, whose name he would come to know as Lena, hesitated for a second. The tears stopped, replaced by a look of exhaustion that didn't belong on a child's face. "We don't have any," she answered, her voice low and empty. The response was so direct, so devoid of drama, that it caught him off guard. He had expected an elaborate story, a sob story about parents who abandoned her. The simplicity of those 4 words was more impactful than any wail. Arthur felt the ground beneath his feet become less solid. His fortress of certainty was being shaken by a thin, barefoot girl on the cold grass of his lawn. Distrust was still his compass, but the needle was beginning to spin wildly. "Oh, where do you live?" he pressed, feeling the need to regain control of the situation. Lena pointed with a trembling chin past the high walls of his estate, toward the most neglected part of the city. "In a shack, down by the river. What was left after last year's flood." The image her words painted was desolate. A makeshift shelter, flimsy against the cold and hunger. Still, he couldn't give in. He couldn't allow himself to be deceived. Compassion was a trap, and he would not be the prey. There was only one way to resolve this, to restore logic and order to his mind. He needed to see. He needed the final proof that would absolve him of this uncomfortable feeling beginning to settle in his chest. A feeling he didn't recognize, but which felt dangerously like doubt. He needed to confirm the lie so he could go back to believing in the world as he knew it. Looking into Lena's frightened eyes, he made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. Though he didn't know it at the time, he wasn't going to call the police, at least not yet. First, he would be the detective, judge, and jury. "Take me to him," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for refusal. Now, Lena led him through the dark, silent streets that bordered his property, a stark contrast to the opulence they left behind. The mansions with their illuminated gardens gave way to more modest houses, then to commercial buildings with their steel doors shuttered, and finally to a maze of unpaved alleys where the streetlights were scarce and darkness seemed to pool in the corners like dust. The air grew heavier, thick with the smell of dampness and neglect. Arthur followed a few paces behind the girl, his expensive sedan gliding slowly over the uneven ground, its headlights cutting through the gloom. He felt like an intruder in a world he always knew existed, but had actively chosen to ignore. Every puddle of mud he steered around, every dark window he passed, seemed a silent testament to a reality he considered distant and irrelevant to his own. The girl stopped in front of a precarious structure, a jumble of rotting wood, rusted sheet metal, and plastic tarps, squeezed between the remains of a crumbled wall and the tall weeds growing on the bank of a polluted creek. It was less than a shack. It was an open wound on the urban landscape. Arthur cut the engine, and the ensuing silence was filled by the sound of wind whistling through the cracks of the makeshift dwelling. He got out of the car, his Italian leather shoes sinking slightly into the muddy ground, a feeling of revulsion mixed with his suspicion. It was inconceivable that anyone could live here. Lena didn't wait for him. She slipped through an opening covered by a grimy piece of cloth that served as a door. Arthur hesitated. What was he doing here, in the middle of the night, following a supposed thief to a place that looked like it was about to collapse? His mind screamed at him to return to the safety of his home, to his world of order and cleanliness. But the need to uncover the truth, to prove to himself that his worldview was correct, was stronger. He ducked and passed through the opening, entering the small, dark space. The smell of mold and sickness hit him like a fist. His eyes took a moment to adjust to the darkness, lit only by a sliver of moonlight filtering through a hole in the roof. In one corner, on a pile of rags that served as a mattress, lay the source of Lena's story. A small, huddled form, shivering under a thin, threadbare blanket. It was a boy, not much more than a toddler, his face pale and his lips dry and cracked. A low, constant moan escaped him, a sound of pain that was almost animalistic. Lena knelt beside him, her small hand touching her brother's forehead with a gentleness that contrasted brutally with the squalor of their surroundings. "I'm back, Leo. I brought food," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Arthur stood frozen in the doorway. The scene before him was a direct blow to his cynicism. There was no deception here, no theatrics. There was only raw poverty and real pain. The boy, Leo, was skin and bones. His breathing was shallow and rapid, and his small stomach was visibly swollen beneath his thin shirt. He was severely malnourished, sick, and the help he needed wasn't a carton of milk, but a doctor. A wave of guilt hit him, cold and overwhelming. The memory of his anger, his accusation, his cruel treatment of the girl in his garden now burned inside him. He had seen her as a criminal, when in fact she was a desperate sister, fighting for her brother's life the only way she knew how. The reality of the situation was far simpler and far more terrible than any scheme his suspicious mind could have concocted. He had been wrong, completely and unequivocally wrong, and the weight of that mistake in that moment felt more crushing than any business failure. That boy's life depended on a decision, and time was running out. Arthur's inertia lasted only an instant, broken by a spasm that racked Leo's frail body. The boy arched his back, a sharp whimper escaping his bluish lips. It was the catalyst Arthur needed. Guilt gave way to a cold, pragmatic urgency, the same he used to solve crises in his company. The difference was that this time, the stakes weren't financial. They were a child's life. "We have to get him to a hospital," he said, his voice sounding strange and loud in the confined space. Lena looked up at him, her eyes wide and frightened, distrust now warring with a flicker of hope. She didn't move, her body forming a protective barrier around her brother. To her, he was still the man who had terrified her in his garden, the angry giant who wanted to take their food. Arthur understood her hesitation. He was a threat, a stranger who represented the world that had rejected them. He needed to break through that barrier, and fast. He knelt, trying to lessen his intimidating presence, keeping a respectful distance. "I'm not going to hurt him," he said, his voice softer now. "He needs a doctor. I can help." He looked into her eyes, trying to convey a sincerity he himself rarely accessed. "Please, let me help." The internal struggle was visible on Lena's face. She looked from Arthur's face to her suffering brother, the weight of an impossible decision on her 7-year-old shoulders. Finally, with an almost imperceptible nod, she relented. Without another second to waste, Arthur moved with calculated efficiency. He took the threadbare blanket, the only one they had, and carefully wrapped it around Leo's small body, surprised by how light he was. He felt as if he weighed no more than a bundle of twigs. As he lifted him, the boy whimpered again but didn't wake. Lena followed closely, her hand clutching a piece of Arthur's shirt, as if afraid he might disappear with her brother at any moment. They left the shack and returned to the car. The juxtaposition was grotesque, the immaculate leather interior and new car smell being invaded by the raw reality of poverty and sickness. He gently placed Leo in the back seat, and Lena curled up beside him, never letting go of his hand. The drive to the nearest hospital was a tense blur. Arthur drove fast, but with a precision that adrenaline gave him. His thoughts a whirlwind of logistics and conflicting emotions. What would he say at the front desk? How would he explain arriving with two grimy children, one of them critically ill? The questions arose, but he pushed them away. The only focus was getting there. Beside him, Lena was silent, her eyes fixed on her brother. In the rearview mirror, Arthur could see the reflection of her face, a mask of worry that aged her childish features. He wondered how long she had been carrying this burden. Months, years. The idea of one child taking care of another, alone against the world, was something his ordered mind refused to fully accept. In the emergency room, the transition was jarring. The bright lights, the smell of antiseptic, the clamor of monitors and hurried voices enveloped them. Arthur, accustomed to commanding any room he entered, felt momentarily lost. He explained the situation to a tired-faced nurse, omitting the details of the break-in and focusing only on the boy's critical condition. Immediately, a medical team surrounded Leo, wheeling him on a gurney into a treatment room. Lena tried to follow, but was gently stopped. She turned to Arthur, panic returning to her eyes. "Are they taking him away?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No," Arthur reassured her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Sure, they're going to take care of him." But as he watched the door swing shut, a new wave of reality hit him. Helping wasn't as simple as a trip to the hospital. The bureaucracy was coming, questions would be asked, and he, a wealthy, single man, suddenly entangled in the lives of two orphaned and destitute children, would become the center of a scrutiny for which he was not prepared. The hospital waiting room was a sterile limbo, painted in faded shades of beige and blue, designed to soothe but only amplifying the anxiety. The hours dragged on, marked by the monotonous tick of a wall clock and the impersonal announcements over the speakers. Arthur sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, his expensive suit rumpled, feeling utterly out of place. Beside him, Lena had finally succumbed to exhaustion. After refusing his offer of a sandwich and a carton of milk from a vending machine, the irony was not lost on Arthur. She had fallen asleep, her head resting on his arm, her small body curled up as if seeking protection from the cold of the room and the world. Watching her sleep, her face finally relaxed from its constant tension, awakened in Arthur a strange sense of responsibility, a weight he had never invited but which now settled firmly on his shoulders. The first obstacle materialized in the form of a middle-aged woman with a sharp gaze and a tight bun. She introduced herself as Helen, the social worker on duty. Her expression was a mixture of professionalism and skepticism. She led him to a small, private room, leaving Lena in the care of a nurse. Helen's questions were direct and incisive. Who was he? What was his relationship to the children? Where were their parents? Arthur answered with the truth, but an edited version of it. He said he'd found the children in a state of extreme need near his property and brought them to the hospital. He omitted the theft, knowing it would only complicate Lena's situation, painting her as a delinquent instead of a victim. Helen listened, taking notes on a legal pad, her face an impenetrable mask. So, Mr. Sterling, one of the most influential businessmen in the city, just happened to find two orphans in the middle of the night and decided to become their savior, she asked, a note of disbelief coloring her voice. The implication was clear. His motives were suspect. Wealthy single men didn't get involved with street kids without an ulterior motive. Was it charity to clear his conscience, a publicity stunt, or something more sinister? Arthur felt anger rise, the same fury he'd felt seeing the shadow in his library. But this time it was different. It was a defensive anger, born from the frustration of having his intentions, still confusing even to himself, so grossly misinterpreted. He kept his composure, using the same steely calm he employed in hostile negotiations. My only motivation, ma'am, is to ensure those children get the care they desperately need. The boy is in critical condition. Shouldn't that be the focus? His response seemed to register with her, but not enough to dissolve the cloud of suspicion. She explained the procedures. The children would be placed in the temporary custody of the state. Child Protective Services would open an investigation to locate any relatives. If none were found, they would go into the foster care system. The words foster care sounded like a sentence in Arthur's mind. He imagined Lena and Leo, already traumatized, being swallowed by an impersonal, overwhelmed system, separated from each other, their identities reduced to a case number. While the conversation with Helen continued, a second, more subtle and painful obstacle was forming. When he returned to the waiting room, Lena was awake. The nurse had given her a juice box and a cracker, which she held but didn't eat. Her eyes, once filled with fear, now held a new emotion, a cold, distant resignation. "You're going to leave now, aren't you?" she asked, her voice flat. The question wasn't a plea, but a statement of fact. Everyone always leaves. The sentence hit him with the force of a punch. He realized her resistance wasn't just against him, but against hope itself. She had been abandoned so many times that kindness had become merely the prelude to another goodbye. The social worker's skepticism was a professional challenge. Lena's was a deep wound. To truly help them, he would have to fight not only the bureaucracy of the system, but also the scars of a world that had taught them never to trust again. The morning sun cast pale, weak rays through the waiting room window, finding Arthur in the exact same position the night had left him. The conversation with Lena had ended in a heavy silence. He had tried to assure her he wasn't going anywhere, but his words sounded hollow in his own ears, lacking the weight of conviction she needed. How could he promise something he didn't understand himself? His life was structured, predictable. Children were not part of the equation. Yet the thought of simply handing them over to the system and returning to his empty house now seemed like a betrayal of monumental proportions. The turning point came in the form of a weary-looking doctor with dark circles under his eyes, but an expression of genuine compassion. He called Arthur into the hallway, away from Lena's hearing. "Mr. Sterling, the boy's condition is more serious than we initially thought," began Dr. Morales, his voice low and grave. "Indeed, the malnutrition is severe, as expected, but there's a complication. Preliminary tests indicate a rare gastrointestinal condition, likely congenital, which has been drastically worsened by the lack of proper nutrition. It causes chronic pain and malabsorption of nutrients. It's why he was so sick." Arthur processed the information. It wasn't just hunger. It was a battle Leo's body had been fighting since birth. "What does that mean? What's the treatment?" he asked, his business mind taking over, seeking solutions and prognoses. The doctor's answer was a bucket of cold water on his need for control. "It means recovery won't be simple. He'll need specialized care, a strict diet, and possibly a series of surgical procedures. It's an expensive, long-term treatment. Even with the best care, the road ahead will be difficult and uncertain." The weight of those words settled in Arthur's chest. The complexity of the situation had increased exponentially. It was no longer a matter of feeding two hungry children. It was about funding a complex medical treatment and ensuring a stable environment for a long and delicate recovery. A state-run shelter, with its limited resources and overworked staff, could never provide the level of care Leo needed. The image of the boy shivering in filthy rags returned with full force. Leaving him in the hands of the system wouldn't just be abandonment, it would be a death sentence. It was in that moment, under the fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor, that Arthur's fog of uncertainty dissipated. The decision crystallized in his mind, not as a logical calculation, but as a visceral, unshakable certainty. He didn't know how, he didn't know the exact steps, but he knew what he had to do. Helen's objections, Lena's distrust, The bureaucratic complexity, all of it became mere obstacles to be overcome, not insurmountable barriers. He would go back to Helen. He would hire the best lawyers. He would move heaven and earth if he had to. He was no longer just helping. He was all in. The line he had always drawn between his life and the world's problems had been erased. He returned to the waiting room, his steps now firm and decided. Lena watched him approach, the same look of resigned expectation on her face. He crouched in front of her, meeting her eyes. "Lena," he said, his voice steady and clear, "your brother is going to need a lot of care for a long time, and I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to stay, and I'm going to help you both, whatever it takes." For the first time, a flicker of something that wasn't fear or distrust glinted in the girl's eyes. It was tiny, fragile, but it was there, a spark of hope. And to Arthur, that spark suddenly seemed more valuable than his entire empire. He just didn't realize that in making that promise, he was declaring war on a system that cared little for his good intentions and opening the door to ghosts from his own past he thought were long buried. Arthur's promise echoed in the waiting room, but reality quickly asserted itself with the force of an unforgiving tide. His first battle was again with Helen, the social worker. Armed with his new resolve, he requested a meeting, this time on his turf, a hospital conference room he managed to book with a few phone calls. He laid out his plan with the precision of a CEO detailing an acquisition. He would cover all of Leo's medical expenses, hire a private nurse if needed, and provide a safe, suitable home for the children. His proposal was met with the same impassive expression as before. "Mr. Sterling, your generosity is noted," Helen said. The words polished but devoid of warmth. However, the welfare of minors is not an item one can simply purchase. There are protocols. The children need emotional stability, not just material comfort. Your sudden appearance in their lives is a destabilizing factor. A single man with no experience with children, taking responsibility for two traumatized minors. The family court system will view this with extreme caution. Every word was a blow to his newfound confidence. He, who was accustomed to doors opening at the mere mention of his name, now found himself entangled in a web of bureaucracy and suspicion that his money couldn't cut through. While the legal fight began, the emotional battle with Lena continued. Arthur visited her every day in the small hospital room where Leo had been moved. He brought coloring books, simple toys, and snacks she rarely touched. She watched him with a vigilant caution, like a wild animal deciding if the outstretched hand offers food or a trap. Her trust was a sandcastle, built and washed away with each tide of uncertainty. One day, she would tell him a little about how she found food. The next, she would refuse to speak to him at all, huddled in a chair in the corner of the room. Arthur, a man of direct, logical communication, felt disarmed. He didn't know how to speak the language of trauma. His gestures, however well-intentioned, felt clumsy and ineffective. Leo's condition, though stabilized, was a constant reminder of the situation's fragility. The boy spent most of his time sleeping, his small body connected to tubes and monitors that beeped in a soft, rhythmic chorus. Seeing him like this, so vulnerable, awakened a protective anxiety in Arthur that he had never felt before. On one particularly difficult afternoon, Leo had a pain crisis, his weak, high-pitched cry echoing in the room. Lena rushed to his side, holding his tiny hand, whispering words of comfort that seemed far too old for her. Arthur stood in the doorway, feeling like a useless spectator, a stranger in a world of pain and love that belonged only to these two siblings. The nurse administered medication, and the crying gradually subsided. But the image of Arthur's powerlessness remained seared in his mind. He could pay for the best doctors, but he couldn't take away their pain. To complicate matters further, Arthur's lawyer, a pragmatic man named Mr. Davies, brought troubling news. The initial social services investigation had located distant relatives of the children, a great-aunt and a cousin living in another state. They've been notified and have expressed interest in guardianship, Davies said, his tone indicating this was a serious problem. Arthur's mind immediately filled with suspicion. Where were these relatives when 2 children were starving in a shack? Why now? He feared their motivation wasn't love, but the possibility of financial gain, either from the government or, worse, from him. The arrival of these phantom relatives added a new layer of complexity to the battlefield, turning his fight to help into a contest for the lives and futures of Lena and Leo. The relatives materialized 2 mornings later, looking like figures from a poorly rehearsed play. Martha, the great-aunt, was a small, bony woman wrapped in a black shawl that seemed too large for her frail frame. She leaned on the arm of her son, Roger, a middle-aged man with an oily smile and eyes that darted around, cataloguing the surroundings with a poorly disguised greed. They didn't ask about Leo's health or Lena's well-being first. Roger's first question, directed at a nurse at the desk, was, "Adi, where can we find Mr. Arthur Sterling?" It told Arthur everything he needed to know. The meeting, orchestrated by a visibly tense Helen, took place in a small, windowless room. The air grew thin with falsehood. "The poor dears, the poor little things," Martha lamented, dabbing a dry eye with the corner of her shawl. "If only we'd known, we would have come sooner. Life is so hard out in the country, you know." Roger took over, his voice full of manufactured compassion. "We're the only family they have. We're blood. We appreciate Mr. Sterling's help, of course, a very noble gesture, but now they belong with us." Arthur felt his blood boil. He watched Helen, trying to read her expression. The social worker was a seasoned professional, and he could see the way her eyes analyzed every gesture, every rehearsed word from the newcomers. She asked simple questions that unraveled them. "When was the last time you saw the children?" There was a pause, a shared glance between mother and son. "It's been a while," Roger said evasively. "After their mother, well, you know, we lost touch." The lie was so transparent it was almost an insult. The battle would not be fought with logic or morals, but with the cold letter of the law. The law favored blood ties, no matter how tenuous or opportunistic. Later that day, Arthur found Lena in the hospital's solarium, a small space with a few plants and plastic chairs. She was sitting alone, staring out at the city through the glass. He sat beside her, silent for a moment. "They don't really like us," she said suddenly, not looking at him. "Mum used to say people like that only show up when they smell money." The raw, painful wisdom of a child who had seen too much shocked Arthur. He didn't know what to say. Instead, he just sat there, his presence a silent promise that she was not alone in this fight. The next day, the veiled threat became a direct offensive. Mr. Davies called him, his voice urgent. "Arthur, they've made their move. They've filed a petition in family court for immediate temporary custody." Arthur felt a chill. "On what grounds?" he asked, his voice tense. "The grounds are kinship, and they're using you against us. They're painting you as a wealthy, solitary stranger with an unusual and potentially harmful interest in 2 vulnerable children. They're implying your environment is unsuitable and your motives are questionable." The injustice of the accusation was suffocating. His attempt to help was being twisted and weaponized against him. The bureaucracy he once saw as a mere obstacle now revealed itself as a monster that could, in fact, devour the children's future by handing them over to predators disguised as family. He was the only shield Lena and Leo had, and that shield was about to be shattered not by a lack of resources or will, but by the calculated cruelty of a system that couldn't tell a savior from a threat. A hearing was set, and time was running against them. The news of the legal petition was like a gut punch, stealing the air from Arthur's lungs. He had spent a lifetime building an empire based on reputation and control. And now he saw it all being twisted into a sordid narrative. Sitting in his home office, the same library where he'd found Lena, he felt surrounded. The book-lined walls, once a symbol of knowledge and power, now seemed to mock his helplessness. On the other end of the line, Mr. Davies was the voice of pragmatic reason. We need a strategy. We need to prove you are the best option for them. And above all, we need to expose the true intentions of Martha and Roger. The strategy unfolded on two fronts. The first was legal. Mr. Davies delved into the relatives' lives, hiring a discreet private investigator to dig into their financial and social history. Meanwhile, Arthur focused on the second, more difficult front, the emotional one. He needed Helen, the social worker, and eventually the judge, to see him not as an eccentric millionaire but as a stable, dedicated father figure. This meant spending more time at the hospital, not as a distant benefactor, but as a constant, reassuring presence. He began to read to Leo, even though the boy slept most of the time. He chose simple children's books, his voice, normally used to command boardrooms, becoming soft and rhythmic as he narrated tales of talking animals and adventures in magical lands. Lena watched him from the corner of the room, her face a blank canvas. Slowly, she began to move closer. First, by sitting in a chair nearer to the bed, then by correcting the voice he made for one of the characters. One day, as he was reading about a lost bear, she sat on the edge of the bed and said, "Leo likes the one about the bunny better." It was the first time she had offered a piece of information about her brother, a small glimpse into their shared world. For Arthur, it was a greater victory than closing any deal. However, Leo's health became the fourth and most terrifying obstacle. One night, the soft beeps of the monitors escalated into a sharp, piercing alarm. A high fever had set in, a complication of his condition. Nurses and doctors rushed into the room, a whirlwind of urgent activity. Arthur and Lena were gently but firmly ushered into the hallway. Behind the closed door, they could hear the muffled sounds of medical commands and Leo's weak cry. Lena was shaking uncontrollably, her face pale with terror. Without thinking, Arthur wrapped his arms around her. She resisted for a moment, then buried herself in his chest, her small sobs muffled against the fabric of his shirt. He held her tightly, feeling her fragility, her fear as if it were his own. In that cold, sterile hallway, holding a terrified child, he finally understood the depth of his promise. It wasn't about money or power. It was about being there, about being the safe harbor in the storm. Hours later, Dr. Morales emerged from the room, his face etched with fatigue. "We got the fever under control. He's stable, but it was a close call. He's fighting, but his body is so weak. Every day is a battle." The phrase echoed in Arthur's mind. Every day is a battle. He was fighting a war on multiple fronts, legal, emotional, and now medical. And the life of an innocent boy was at the center of it all, a fragile prize in a contest that was growing more desperate by the hour. As he looked down at Lena, who had fallen asleep from exhaustion in his arms, he wondered if he had the strength to win. Leo's health crisis marked a subtle but profound shift in the dynamic between Arthur and the children. The shared embrace in the hospital corridor had broken down an invisible wall. Lena, though still cautious, began to show flashes of genuine trust. She started asking questions about his world, about the big house, about the work that kept him so busy. They were simple, childish questions, but to Arthur, they were threads of connection being woven, strengthening a bond he now felt was vital. He showed her pictures of his mansion on his phone, and for the first time, she smiled when she saw the immense garden. "It looks like a park," she whispered in awe. "Could we play hide and seek there?" The question, so normal for a child, so extraordinary coming from her, filled Arthur's heart with a mix of joy and sorrow. Meanwhile, the investigation into Martha and Roger began to bear fruit. The P&H's report painted a grim picture of gambling debts, petty scams, and a life of financial instability. They were not the loving, simple country relatives they claimed to be. They were predators, and Arthur's sudden interest in the children had sounded like a cash register to them. Mr. Davies was exultant. "This is ammunition, Arthur. Heavy ammunition for the hearing." But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Helen, the social worker, requested a private meeting with Arthur without lawyers present. Her expression, once a mask of professional skepticism, now held traces of reluctant respect and concern. "Mr. Sterling, during my own investigation, I spoke with neighbors from the children's mother's old address," she began, her voice low and serious. "I discovered something you won't find in any official report." She paused, measuring the impact of her next words. "Lena tried to get help, several times." Arthur felt a knot form in his stomach. Helen continued. "She knocked on neighbors' doors, and they ignored her. She asked for food at a local bakery, and the owner chased her away. She even tried to talk to a police officer in the park, who told her he couldn't do anything without an adult present. She was systemically failed by everyone who should have protected her. Society, the system, me. We failed her." Helen's confession wasn't just information. It was a testament to Lena's resilience and desperation. She hadn't turned to theft as her first option, but as her last. The world had cornered her, offering only one way out, and that way was through Arthur's library window. The revelation hit him with the force of a wave. The image of Lena, small and determined, facing a world of indifference, was unbearable. His own reaction that night, the anger, the accusation, seemed even more monstrous in light of this new truth. He hadn't just been the victim of a petty theft, he had been the final obstacle in a desperate race for survival. The weight of his initial failure to see her desperation crushed him. But with the guilt came a fierce clarity. His fight for these children was no longer just about righting a wrong or satisfying an impulse of charity. It was about justice. It was about proving that in a world that had turned its back on them, there would be one person who wouldn't. He thanked Helen. The animosity between them finally dissolved and replaced by a tacit alliance. When he returned to the hospital room, he found Lena drawing in a notebook he'd given her. She was concentrating, the tip of her tongue sticking out, sketching a big house with a huge garden. Next to the house, she drew 3 stick figures, a big one, a small one, and an even smaller one lying on the grass. All 3 had wide, clumsy smiles on their faces. She looked up at him, holding up the drawing with shy pride. In that moment, Arthur knew that no matter how dirty the fight got, he could not lose. That drawing wasn't just a wish. It was a future worth fighting for with every fiber of his being. The week leading up to the hearing was a storm of emotion and preparation. Mr. Davies put him through mock cross-examinations, testing his patience, questioning his motives, forcing him to articulate feelings he could barely name to himself. Each session left him exhausted, stripped of his usual defenses. At the same time, the most terrifying news came from Dr. Morales. Leo's latest scans revealed a critical blockage in his intestine, a direct consequence of his congenital condition worsened by prolonged malnutrition. "We can't wait any longer," the doctor said, his face grave. "He needs emergency surgery. It's a high-risk procedure, given his fragility, but without it, he has no chance." The surgery was scheduled for the next morning, the same day as the custody hearing. Time seemed to have compressed. Every second loaded with unbearable weight. Arthur had to make the most difficult choice. Would he be at the hospital with Lena, or in the courtroom fighting for their future? Mr. Davies was adamant. "You have to be in court, Arthur. Your absence would be seen as a lack of commitment. Let me have an associate represent you at the hospital. I will keep you informed." The logic was undeniable, but the thought of leaving Lena alone during her brother's surgery was agony. That night, The hospital felt like a silent, tense shrine. Arthur stayed with Lena late. They didn't talk much. They sat side by side, watching Leo, who slept a medicated sleep, oblivious to the battle being waged for him and within him. The girl was strangely calm, a stillness that was more disturbing than tears. It was the calm of someone already bracing for the worst. Just before he left, Arthur knelt in front of her. "Lena, tomorrow is going to be a hard day. I have to go to a place to talk to a judge. It's to make sure we can all stay together, so no one can ever separate you two. But my heart will be right here, with you and Leo, every minute." She just nodded, her eyes fixed on her brother. But then, as he stood to leave, her small hand reached out and grabbed the sleeve of his coat. "You told me the story about the brave little rabbit," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Oh, the one who was scared of the dark woods, but went in anyway to save his friend." He turned back, his heart aching. "Yes, I remember. You have to be the brave little rabbit tomorrow," she said, her eyes finally meeting his. "For us." The morning arrived, grey and cold. In the courtroom, the air was heavy and formal. Arthur sat next to Mr. Davies, his perfectly pressed suit a useless armor against the anxiety consuming him. Across the room, Martha and Roger looked confident, whispering with their lawyer. Arthur's phone vibrated in his pocket. A text from Davies' associate at the hospital. "They've taken Leo into surgery." The judge's gavel struck, and the hearing began. Simultaneously, a few miles away, a scalpel made the first incision. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Roger's lawyer painted a distorted picture of Arthur. But the emotional climax, the true breaking point, didn't happen there. It happened when Mr. Davies got an urgent call from the hospital. He leaned over and whispered in Arthur's ear, his face pale. "It's Leo. There's a complication. His pressure dropped. They're fighting to stabilize him." In that instant, the courtroom, the judge, the custody dispute, it all vanished. The only reality was the image of a small, fragile boy fighting for his life on an operating table. Raw, overwhelming fear broke through every barrier Arthur still maintained. Tears he hadn't shed since his own childhood welled in his eyes, hot and uncontrollable. He stood up, interrupting the lawyer mid-sentence. His voice, when he spoke, was not that of a powerful CEO, but of a terrified father. "Your Honor, excuse me," he said, his voice cracking. "I have to go. My son needs me." The word son left his mouth with a naturalness that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. And in that moment of total vulnerability, he no longer cared about strategy, about winning or losing. He just needed to be there. Arthur's declaration hung in the stunned silence of the courtroom. The judge, an older man with a seen-it-all gaze, watched him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Mr. Davies looked like he was about to have a heart attack, but the genuine despair on his client's face stopped him. Before anyone could object, the judge struck his gavel. "1 hour recess," he declared, his voice firm. Arthur didn't wait. He turned and walked out of the room, running through the marble corridors, urgency overriding any sense of decorum. The drive back to the hospital was a blur of ignored traffic lights and distant horns. His mind was a loop of silent prayers and the image of Lena's terrified face. He found her in the surgical wing hallway, curled up in a chair, all alone. Helen was on the phone a few feet away, her face tense. Lena wasn't crying. She was motionless, her eyes fixed on the double doors marked "Restricted Access." When she saw him, her body seemed to relax ever so slightly. He sat beside her, pulling her into an embrace. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm here." They sat like that, in a shared silence of fear and hope for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the doors opened and Dr. Morales emerged. He pulled off his surgical mask, his face exhausted but with a glimmer in his eyes Arthur didn't dare to interpret. It was more complicated than we anticipated, the doctor said, his voice weary. The blockage was severe, and his body reacted poorly to the anesthesia. We had some very critical moments. But he's a fighter. We stabilized him. The surgery was a success. The road to recovery will be long, but he's through the worst of it. A collective sigh of relief seemed to sweep through the hallway. Lena, for the first time, collapsed into tears, not of fear, but of pure exhaustion and gratitude. Arthur held her, feeling his own tears of relief stream down his face. The first and most important battle had been won. When they returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted. News of the successful surgery and the hospital drama had apparently spread. The judge was waiting, and when Arthur walked in, his gaze was no longer one of assessment, but of quiet understanding. Mr. Davies presented the evidence gathered on Martha and Roger, the debts, the history of instability. But the final, most compelling piece of the puzzle came from Helen. Called to the stand, she didn't just present her technical report. In a clear, firm voice, she recounted Lena's journey for help, the neglect she suffered, and then described the transformation she had witnessed in Arthur. I saw a man who, at first, fit the skeptical profile my work has taught me to distrust, she said, looking directly at the judge. But I also saw that same man spend sleepless nights in a hospital chair. I saw him learn to read children's stories, and today I heard him call a sick little boy his son, with a sincerity no amount of wealth can buy. The system failed these children. Arthur Sterling has not. Helen's testimony was devastating. Martha and Roger withered in their seats, their charade exposed. The judge's decision, when it came, was swift and decisive. He granted Arthur temporary guardianship of Lena and Leo, with a clear path to adoption, citing the evident emotional bond and unwavering commitment to the children's welfare. The second victory was won. Leaving the courthouse, Arthur held Lena's hand. The journey had been excruciating, but as he looked at her face, now free from the shadow of imminent fear, he knew every second had been worth it. They had a future, but before he could build that future, Arthur needed to confront his own past. One last piece, he was finally ready to fit into the puzzle of his own life. 5 weeks, it felt like a lifetime. The sound that now filled the afternoons at Arthur Sterling's mansion was no longer oppressive silence or the distant hum of a lawnmower. It was the sound of children's laughter, sharp and infectious, echoing across the garden. The same garden where, on a night that seemed to belong to another man, another world, he had hunted a thief. Now, on that very spot, a 4-year-old boy with rosy cheeks and tousled hair chased a colorful soccer ball, his steps steady on the green grass. Leo was fully recovered, the energy radiating from him the living proof of a small miracle. Near the rose bushes, Lena, sporting a small scrape on her knee that she wore like a trophy, was teaching a doll how to read, mimicking the soft voice Arthur used for their nightly stories. She was finally a child, concerned with scraped knees and doll lessons, not with her brother's hunger or survival. Arthur watched them from the library window. The afternoon sun streamed through the same pane of glass where he had first seen the furtive shadow. In that glass, he now saw the reflection of a man he barely recognized. The expensive suit had been replaced by comfortable slacks and a cotton shirt. The hard set of his face had given way to a soft crease of contentment. It was there, in that moment of peace, that the memory came, not with pain, but with serene clarity. He remembered himself at 8 years old, in a cold orphanage, staring through a barred window at families walking down the street, feeling an emptiness so vast he thought it would swallow him whole. He had spent his entire life building walls around that abandoned boy, protecting him with wealth and power, mistaking isolation for safety. He thought he was protecting himself from being failed again, but in reality, he was only condemning himself to a perpetual solitude. Lena and Leo hadn't just broken into his house, they had broken into his inner fortress, found that scared little boy, and brought him out into the light. By giving them a home, he had finally given one to himself. "Dad, dinner's ready," Lena's voice called from the doorway. The word "Dad," which had slipped out in a moment of panic in the courtroom, was now his name, his most precious identity. He smiled and joined them in the dining room. The long, polished mahogany table, once set for one, now had 3 places. A drawing of a smiling sun was held by a magnet to the stainless steel refrigerator. A small sneaker lay abandoned near the staircase. The house was no longer a museum of perfection. It was a home, with the happy mess of life pulsing in every corner. Seated at the table, the conversation was about Lena's first day of school and what color they should paint Leo's room. It was a symphony of normalcy, the most beautiful music Arthur had ever heard. Later, with the children fast asleep in their new rooms, Arthur walked back out into the garden. The night was clear and the stars shone brightly. He looked back at the house, now filled with warm lights and quiet dreams. He realized the rigidity that had governed him was just fear disguised as principle. His distrust was the scar of an old wound. That night, 5 weeks ago, he thought he had found the worst of humanity in his garden. Instead, he had found his own humanity waiting to be rediscovered. The greatest wealth, he now understood, wasn't in what you accumulated and protected behind high walls, but in the courage to tear those walls down and share what is most valuable, a safe place to call home. The greatest treasures of his life hadn't been in a vault. They had arrived disguised as thieves in the night, carrying not valuables, but the priceless chance for redemption.